So Professor Ruth Vanita is Professor of English at the University of Montana. She previously taught at Delhi University for 20 years. She was the founding co-editor of Manushi between 1978 to 1990, which is India's first nationwide feminist magazine. She's the author of several books, including the 2020 novel Memory of Light, Love's Right Same-Sex Marriages in Modern India, which was published in 2005, and the updated 2021 edition is what we'll be drawing on today. Gender, Sex and the City, Urdu Rekti Poetry in India, between 1780 and 1870, which was published in 2012, and Dancing with the Nation, Courtesans in Bombay Cinema, which was published in 2017. She's the co-editor of the pioneering Same-Sex and Love, a literary history, and has translated many works of fiction and poetry from Hindi and Urdu to English, most notably Chocolate, Stories on Male-Male Desire by Pandey Bechar Sharma Ugra, published in 2008. She divides her time between Misola and Gurgaon, and her next book, The Dharma of Justice in the Sanskrit Epics, Debates on Gender, Varna, and Species, will appear from Oxford University Press in January 2022. Professor Vanita, as we have said repeatedly, we are very, very honored to have you with us today, and the floor is now all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me, and especially to Ritika for all her work organizing the details. I'll begin today with the current debate around marriage equality in India, which the Indian media is highlighting because of the petitions pending before the Delhi High Court. Most people, I think that the demand for marriage equality arose in India in the 21st century, following the movement in the West, and especially following the Supreme Court of India overturning the anti-sodomy law in 2018. Most people do not know that the struggle for marriage equality has been going on in India since at least 1980. The media barely acknowledges this, and I don't know how much it is mentioned in the lawsuits. Just as the final 3 years of the campaign against Section 377 get the most media attention because of the celebrities who filed the final amicus curiae petition, Navteej Singh Johar, and the celebrity lawyers who argued that case, even though there was a nearly 30-year legal and extra-legal battle that preceded the victory, with the participation of many petitioners and lawyers who worked long-term. So also, my contention is that the struggle for marriage equality has been going on for more than 30 years and was waged over the years by many almost unknown people. And that is why they don't get mentioned, because they are almost unknown. These petitions, the current ones, are arguing for, I'm just going to share the screen from here. These petitions are asking for amendment of the Special Marriage Act, the Hindu Marriage Act, which regulates marriage between any two Hindus, and Special Marriage Act is marriage between any two Indians, and the Foreign Marriage Act, which recognizes marriages of Indian citizens outside India, conducted outside India. The petitioners are all middle-class professionals, and I'll return to this point. So just to give you a glimpse, you may have seen these before already. Kavita Arora and Ankita Khanna, they are a Delhi-based couple. They are asking for amendment of the Special Marriage Act, which regulates marriage between any two Indians. They said in interviews that the COVID pandemic brought home to them the importance of financial and emotional security. For example, in the event of one person being hospitalized, the spouse would not be recognized as legal next of kin and could be deprived of the right to make health-related decisions. And I have actually seen this just before the pandemic. Somebody I know, a young woman in Delhi, her partner who was living with her, they'd faced a lot of family disapproval, suddenly died of cerebral hemorrhage, a very young woman. And the partner's family just swooped down and took her away while she was still alive. And her partner was not consulted at all. She was just treated as a friend and a roommate. Vaibhav Jain, an Indian citizen, and Parag Mehta, a US citizen of Indian origin, were married in Texas by Hindu rites with the full support of their families. They are asking for amendment of the Foreign Marriage Act, under which their marriage would be recognized if they were a man and a woman. Now, non-recognition of their marriage, what does it mean, and how does it matter? It means that Parag, who is an overseas citizen of India, he could not enter India during the pandemic at a time when a foreign spouse of an Indian citizen would have been allowed to enter. This discrimination has, now these two live in the US pretty much, but still they have family in India. This discrimination has severely affected another couple who are not petitioners. And they are Aditya Advani, an OCI holder, and Michael Tarr, his husband of many years, who's a US citizen. These two, Michael and Aditya, were among the first middle-class couples to get married by Hindu rites in 1993 at the home of Aditya's parents in Delhi. I was living and working in Delhi at the time. I didn't know about this marriage, but later I met Swami Bodhananda, who conducted the marriage, and I interviewed him in Love's Rite. So they were married in 1993, then they lived in San Francisco. But about a decade ago, they moved back to Delhi to raise their twins. Now, Michael in India is legally a stranger to both his husband and his children, because their legal marriage in the US is not recognized by the Indian government, it's not recognized in India. So Michael is in India on a tourist visa, and he has to leave the country every 6 months, okay? Before the pandemic, he had gone to the UK to visit his mother, and he was not allowed back for more than 1.5 years. I think he's just managed to get back now. The restrictions have been lifted on tourist visas. Had he been married to a female OCI holder, he would have been allowed back into India immediately. So this is how it matters. This is why it matters. In my 2005 book, Love's Rite, I made several legal arguments, which are now being used in the lawsuits. And I've seen them mentioned on the internet as well. So at least some of the arguments are being used. I've come to realize that it's a measure of the success of one's work when one's ideas become commonly accepted without attribution. For example, I argued that the Hindu Marriage Act uses the terms bride and groom, not woman and man. It says this is an act to regulate the marriage between a bride and groom, not a woman and man. When it refers to two spouses, it says two Hindus, and then it says bride and groom. Now, in Indian literature and history, men have often referred to themselves as brides, brides of God, brides of male saints, both Hindu and Muslim. Most of the young female couples whom I'm going to talk about, who have been married by Hindu rites since 1987, they refer to themselves as bride and groom or as husband and wife. Most of them did. Therefore, you could argue that these marriages should be recognized under the HMA, under the Hindu Marriage Act. In one very interesting case of redefining the idea of a bride, like what is a bride? A Muslim man called Harfan, this was in 2004 in Ghaziabad, which is near Delhi. He was married to a woman already, but he took advantage of the legal provision that an Indian Muslim man can marry up to 4 wives or brides. So he married his male lover, Mustafa, who was dressed as a woman, and then he brought Mustafa home. The family knew that this was a male. They might have already known this guy, and they thought it was a joke, so they were fine. But when the couple then brought in a flower-decked marriage bed, the family got enraged and beat them up. And the newspaper report ended. This is 2004, so it's fairly early. And the report ended. This controversy does not seem to have deterred the couple that plans to live together as man and wife. Now, note the terms man and wife, so they're presenting themselves. My second argument with regard to the law was that the Hindu Marriage Act recognizes any wedding that is performed according to the ceremonies. This is the language from the text, the ceremonies that are customary in the community of either one of the spouses, okay? So there is no prescribed format for a Hindu wedding under the law. It's not like you have to do this, this, and this, nor is a license required, nor is a registration required for the marriage. This is because Hindu weddings, as we know, vary very widely. From a simple exchange of garlands, that can be a marriage, to a 5-day-long ceremony, that can be a marriage. So if it is customary in the community of only one of the partners, then that is accepted as a marriage legally. Hindu scriptures recognize 8 types of marriage, including Gandharva Vivah, an idea still very widely known, in which the 2 partners garland one another, or they walk around the fire. No officiant is needed, no witnesses are needed. Now, this type of marriage is well known, and it's often depicted in narratives such as that of Shakuntala, which everyone knows, and also in Indian cinema. There's this frequent garlanding of one another in the temple as a marriage. This legal provision raises the question, what is a custom and what is a community? So you have to be married according to the customs of the community of one of the 2. But what is a custom and what is a community? These are hard to define. And in many cases, which I've looked at, just not same-sex marriage cases, other cases, the court has considered these questions. For instance, there are LGBT communities in India in which several marriages have taken place over time. For example, the Lakshya Trust in Vadodara in Gujarat has overseen weddings for at least 2 decades. Now that's a community, you could say that that is a community, and according to their customs, they have been marriages celebrated. Third, in most religions, including Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity, the crucial element of marriage is mutual consent of the partners. The marriage takes place at the time when there is mutual consent. All the rest is just the trappings. In 1905, an important Christian theologian, whom I've quoted in Love's Right, stated the church does not marry anyone. Okay, I just want to repeat, the church does not marry anyone. 2 people marry each other, and the church blesses the union. Okay, so until the 13th century, this blessing by the church did not even take place inside the church, because marriage was considered a secular arrangement, secular in the older meaning of that term, that is the domain that is outside religion. Marriage was considered a secular arrangement, not a religious one. In the 21st century, the Indian and international media have reported several middle and upper class same-sex weddings between Indians or between Indians and non-Indians. These include some celebrity weddings, such as that of hotelier Keshav Suri or of fashion designer Wendell Rodrigues. And nowadays, I notice in the newspapers that the media will frequently report a wedding, one of these middle-class professional weddings, most of which, interestingly, are between men. And it will say that this is the first wedding of its kind in Punjab, or the first in Banaras, or the first between Sikhs. This is not only inaccurate, but unjust, because it involves erasing the history of the struggle for marriage equality. And okay, my main argument is that the real pioneers of this struggle, and many of them are actually the martyrs of this struggle, are the hundreds of low-income, non-English speaking couples, mostly women, who have been marrying or committing joint suicide or both since at least 1980. I collected these newspaper reports since 1980, and after the book was published, I continued to collect them, and I have many more now. So in the updated edition in 2021, I have a list of these couples only from the English press and a few from the Hindi language press. There must be many others in the local language presses to which I don't have access. And even from the English language press, I keep finding more and more reports that from earlier that I didn't have. Now, who are these couples who married in this way? Many of them had performed a religious ceremony, and then after the ceremony, they went to the police or they went to the registrar of marriages, and they asked for the marriages to be legally registered, and of course they were refused. So what I'm saying is they were making the demand. They didn't have the wherewithal to go to file a suit in the High Court. And this, interestingly, from 1980s onward, it's before there's any real LGBT movement in India. It's before there's any movement for marriage equality in India, certainly. And in fact, there's very little of a marriage movement for marriage equality anywhere in the world at this time. These couples include Hindus, mostly Hindus, but Sikhs also, Christians also, a couple of Muslims, Dalits, many tribals, fisherwomen, factory workers, health workers, domestic workers. They hail from all over India, from villages to small towns to cities. And the main point about them is they are non-English speaking. They had nothing whatsoever to do with any movement. And most of them had not heard and did not use any word like lesbian or gay or transgender or queer or anything. Through the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, these weddings and joint suicides were collecting and were happening, and I was collecting the reports. And my question was, what made these couples choose the language of marriage and of death? So most of the families tried, and still today try, to separate the partners and either cajole them into cross-sex marriage or force them into cross-sex marriage. In some cases, they lock them up, deprive them of access to telephones, beat them, occasionally even murder them. And if the couple elopes, the families usually file a false case claiming that the older woman, it's usually a woman, has kidnapped the younger woman. Now, none of this is unique to same-sex couples, and I do want to emphasize that. Cross-sex couples whose families disapprove of their relationship treat them in the same way, often much more harshly, in fact. But the crucial difference is that cross-sex couples, if they can reach the courts, they do have the protection of the law. Once they are married, they can be extra-legally harassed or killed, but they do have the right to marry, and they cannot be legally deprived of the rights that accrue with marriage. Just a question, should I be admitting these people who enter the waiting room, or do you want to do that? Okay.
Oh.
You do it, okay. Now, same-sex couples don't have this protection. The best they can hope for, if they are fortunate enough to be brought to court, and this happened a lot from the 90s onwards, is that the court will uphold their right as adults to live with whomever they want. Have consistently upheld the fact that in all such cases, the two adults, regardless of gender, have the constitutional right to live together. So the marriage may be extra legal, but it's not illegal. For instance, and then again, the media misreports some of this. In the 2012 case of Veena and Savita, when a court stated that this couple has a constitutional right to live together, journalists reported that this is the first time this has happened. And this has happened because the anti-sodomy law has been overturned. This is absolutely incorrect, because courts have been saying exactly this much before homosexuality was decriminalized. And here I want to say that the question of marriage and the question of sodomy are actually separate questions, because what two people do in marriage, what sexual acts they perform, is not known to anyone, even for any couple, right? So just the fact that they are married does not prove that they have committed so-called sodomy under section 377, right? And these marriages were occurring much before any petition had been filed to overturn section 377. Okay. But the thing is, the court saying they can live together is not enough protection for these young couples, because the scandal resulting from their tussle with their families and their local communities results in the couple being isolated and shunned. They cannot find a place to stay in the village or the neighborhood because everyone knows everyone else there. And since they come from low-income groups, they lose their employment. They don't have a lot of mobility. They don't have nowhere to live. They are not like middle-class professionals. They can't move around easily. Kinship networks are the primary safety net that are available to the poor in India. And when they lose this network, it's really difficult to survive. So that is why most couples succumb to pressure of this kind. Couples from these backgrounds succumb to pressure and separate. The few couples who did succeed in staying together generally did so by running away, either from a rural to an urban area or from one town to another. But sadly, most couples don't have the wherewithal even for this limited type of migration. And I've seen in case after case, they are forced to return to the region that they know. They are unemployed, or they have local employment, low paid employment. They have no contacts outside their kinship network. And recently this has begun to change, but it's still true that many of them have no contact with any LGBT or other movement. And so we tend to think of migration as being from one country to another. Like we did a lot of cases about gay people who go from one country to another, LGBT people, right? But the only migration available to many of these poor couples, is from life to death, or from this life to what they perceive as the next life. And so many of them commit joint suicide, which, as far as I know, is an Asian phenomenon rather than a Western one, today at least. And they leave behind notes stating that they will be married in the next life or in another world. And they ask to be cremated or to be buried together. Okay, here are two examples. The first one is from 1980. I don't have a picture, unfortunately. In 1980, I saw for the first time in a newspaper the faces of Indians whom we could call lesbian or gay. They didn't use that word. The persons whose faces I saw were not activists or academics. They were Malika and Lalitambika, two young women who tied their hands together with a ribbon and jumped into the channel in Cochin, Kerala. They left behind their love letters written in Malayalam, in one of which Lalita wrote in her suicide note, "I cannot part with Malika, bury us together." The tabloid newspaper Blitz carried a report with a photograph of the two girls. They were rescued. Actually, they didn't die. They were rescued and they were forced apart. Nearly 40 years later, in 2018, and over 1,000 miles away, so in 2018, in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, two women factory workers, Asha Thakur and Bhavna Thakur, tied their hands together with a stole and jumped into the Sabarmati River, and they died, with Asha's 3-year-old daughter. She also died. They left behind a suicide note in Gujarati saying, and this is the note, "We have left this world to live with each other. The world did not allow us to stay together. Perhaps in the next birth, we will meet again." It's written in lipstick on this paper plate. So in Love's Right, I argue that those who commit joint suicide, leaving such statements behind, they envision their union as marriage, for which there are many antecedents, of course, in world literature. Scores of female couples have committed joint suicide in this way, several of them after marrying each other in a Hindu temple, or privately performing some wedding rites, such as exchanging garlands or applying vermilion sindoor in the hair parting. These reports come from every state in India. I do want to emphasize that because there was a report, a study written on Kerala, which a good study, which listed many couples. And because of that study, people say, oh, this is mostly happening in Kerala. That's not true. The study occurred in Kerala, but the reports are from all over the country. I collected reports of well over 200 couples, and this, as I said, is just the tip of the iceberg. So most of them are women, but a few male couples have also committed joint suicide. In 2007, two villagers, both aged 26, Swapan Manna, a barber, and Jayanta Ghosh, a farmer, they took poison together and their bodies were found in an embrace at the memorial site of a freedom fighter in their village in West Bengal. Both of the men were married to women, and villagers reported afterwards that their families and also the local Communist Party, which at the time was in power, CPIM, the head of the village council had pressured them to separate, and they had faced ridicule, they had faced threats, etc. From the 1990s onwards, LGBT organizations have written reports on a few of these joint suicides and have offered support to some of the runaway couples who married by religious rites. However, even today, many such weddings continue outside the purview of LGBT movements. For example, here in 2019, these two young women married in a temple in Varanasi. They're from a village and they married in a temple in Varanasi. And then, of course, using new technology, they uploaded pictures of their wedding to social media and they approached the police for protection. I wanted to show a short video clip of two village women from Hamirpur in UP. Let me see if I can find the picture. I can't. I may have to, I forgot to put it up, so I may have to show it at the end. They have been in love for 6 years, but their families forcibly married them off to men. It's a very short 1.5 minute, and they speak. You actually hear their voices. This is in these earlier cases, most of these cases you don't. So the video shows them marrying each other outside the office of the registrar and stating that they have already married each other in their village and asking the government to accept their marriage and to help them obtain the same rights as all citizens have. So more interesting to me than the violent families are those families who from 1987 onwards, have accepted these marriages after initial disapproval and have even helped to arrange these marriages. I was puzzled by this. The first one was this famous one in 1987. I was puzzled by why did the families agree? And I didn't have an explanation when I wrote the book. And after continued examination of the question, I now think that families are more likely to accept such a wedding when one or both partners are widowed or divorced. In this very famous case in 1987, which made national headlines, two policewomen, Leela and Urmila, got married in central India. They were promptly suspended from the police force. Urmila was divorced and Leela was widowed with 3 children. And then Urmila's family accepted them and arranged a wedding reception for them in her village home. Likewise, in the 2012 case of Vetka and Melka, two poor tribal women in Odisha who work as manual laborers. Vetka had suffered years of abuse in her marriage to an alcoholic man. The two women did face persecution, but they were finally allowed to return to their village and to marry. And the village elders charged a substantial fine, a barrel of liquor, a sack of rice, and a pair of oxen. But still, they were allowed to live together. But there are exceptions. So I've said there's a pattern, but there are exceptions to this pattern. In the case of Jaya and Tanuja, two healthcare professionals, both families had had bitter experiences with abusive husbands and fathers. So even though both the women were single, Jaya's family accepted the marriage, which took place at a ceremony with 200 guests, and this is a long time ago. And Jaya's sister married a man at the same time, which shows the sort of the acceptance. But the family acceptance is not enough because this became apparent when after the ceremony, the two women approached the registrar of marriages, who happened to be a woman also, who told them they could have any ceremony they wanted, but the government would not recognize it as a marriage. And the same week, the landlord of their flat asked them to vacate the premises. So if you don't have any non-discrimination law, you can get married today and, as we know, lose your job tomorrow. So that's what happened in terms of the housing. A contrary kind of exception appears. This is the temple in which Jaya and Tanuja got married. Interestingly, many of the marriages are in goddess temples. A different exception appears in a 2012 case in Haryana, North India. Savita, a primary school teacher, was married off to a policeman in Uttar Pradesh. Her husband and in-laws were violently abusive to the point that she contemplated suicide, but nobody came to help her. It was her childhood friend and confidant, Veena, who had grown up with her in the village. She discovered the abuse and she persuaded Savita's family to accept her back. Veena supported Savita in getting the village council to dissolve the marriage. And that's how most marriages in India are, the marriages are arranged outside of government purview, dissolved outside of government purview, and remarriage happens outside of purview. And some women's organizations think this is not a good thing and all marriages should be registered. I don't agree. And I've argued in Love's Right that this is in fact better for many reasons. Savita's family, so now though she was divorced, Savita's family still did not agree to let her live with Veena. They tried to get her remarried to a man, but she refused and she threatened suicide. Veena's family agreed to let Savita move in, but Savita's family swore to kill them. So the two families took different views. And her maternal uncle turned up with goons to threaten them. So they had to flee. They fled the village. And what was Veena's family's view? There are conflicting reports. One report says that Veena was the youngest of 6 siblings. She was always treated as a boy by her family. And she had taken her deceased elder brother's place in supporting the family and acting as a father to her brother's 4 children. But when the couple, so she was being viewed as a boy, in other words, but when the couple fled and hid in Veena's cousin's house in Manesar, which is a town close to Delhi, her cousin, Veena's cousin, was reported to have said, if 2 friends want to stay together, what's the harm in that? So he clearly saw them as 2 women friends. Okay, so the perceptions were not the same. When the Gurgaon court stated that the couple have the right to live together, their lawyer correctly said that this is not an acknowledgement of marriage, because many newspapers said, oh, they have been married, their marriage is recognized. And the lawyer said, no, this only recognized their rights as individuals. Okay, after this conflict, the 2 women were eager, even after this conflict and all these threats to their lives and so on, the women were eager to return to their village, Doghat, because Veena needed to manage the farm and Savita wanted to complete her BA. In other words, they wanted to go back to the place they were used to. There's another type of exception to my idea that families who accept same-sex weddings usually do so if one woman has been widowed or divorced. These patterns I've only noticed much after writing the book. So another exception is when one family member happens to be exceptionally sympathetic, such as the 2005 case of 2 tribal schoolgirls, Nitima Birua and Lakshmi Bari. Both are from very poor families in village Bharbaria in Jharkhand in central India. Nitima's brother Birsa championed them when he found that attempts to break them up did not work. And then both the families came around and they arranged the marriage by Hindu rites. Okay. Now, in some of the cases I have studied, one woman presents herself and dresses as a man, or rather as a boy, since most of them are very young. And in India, grooms are called boys and brides are called girls. In our parlance, this could be considered transgender, though most of the persons concerned didn't use any such term. In a couple of cases, though, they did go ahead and have sex change surgery, so they could be classified as transgender. An example is from 1987. Tarulata, 33, this is in Gujarat. She undertook a sex change operation and she took the name Tarun Kumar. And after that, she married a woman named Leela Chawda in a civil and a religious ceremony in Gujarat, Western India. So she had become a man, so she had a civil ceremony too. But then Leela's father challenged the validity of the marriage in court. And he said that a man, he doesn't recognize this Tarun Kumar as a man. He said a man is one who can have natural intercourse and can procreate. Now, of course, several Hijras have gotten married by Hindu rites. And in 2019, the Madras High Court declared that marriage between a man and a trans woman is legally valid. So this is one kind of LGBT marriage which is recognized between a man and a trans woman. Another pattern I have noticed is that in almost all cases of joint suicide, both the women present themselves as women. That is, they dress as women and present as women in the suicide cases. Not always, but mostly. When one woman presents as a man or even somewhat man-like and the other as feminine, the marriage is more likely to be accepted by at least some people. Again, there are exceptions to this pattern too. Both women presenting as women nevertheless manage to marry and stay together. There are also couples where one presents as male and they nevertheless face intense pressure. In 2005, for example, in Mumbai, there was a relationship between Pallavi, a doctor, and Noreen, a healthcare worker, discovered by their families. And they each lived with her parents. Pallavi is Hindu, Noreen is Christian, but the religious difference was not the issue. Noreen's sister married a Hindu man. She faced familial disapproval, but she was vehemently opposed to these 2 women's relationship, though she had married a Hindu man. With the help of lesbian activists in Mumbai and Delhi, and I was also in Delhi and helped at the time, the couple fled to Delhi and they followed a series of migrations within Delhi. Noreen's father, who was a police officer, pursued them along with his colleagues. And the women took refuge in the home of Betu Singh and her partner Maya Shankar. Betu ran a lesbian organization, Sangani Trust, out of a small apartment in a middle-class neighborhood. The police descended on the house and beat up Betu, who was all of like 5'1" or something, and tried to prevent them from entering. The women had to take shelter in different locations. They ended up living with Betu for months, and that also led to conflict if you go and live with people you don't know for months, right? After much drama, the two women finally managed to find jobs, and they rented a flat in Noida, which is a satellite town of Delhi. After a while, their families came around. They even visited them. But then when I met them again after they had settled, the couple told me that they miss Mumbai, they miss their network, they miss their friends and family. Despite being middle-class professionals, they still missed that community. They felt very isolated in Noida, and they told me they were considering migrating to Canada to find community. And then they just disappeared. And very recently, I found out from Maya that Betu died in 2013, sadly, that the couple broke up. Under this intense, it's very hard to survive in this kind of isolation. Noreen married a man, and Pallavi then migrated to Australia. Another dimension of these weddings, which I didn't talk about in Love's Right, but I'm mentioning now, is that they are frequently intercaste, although they are rarely cross-class. I haven't come across many cross-class ones, but intercaste is quite common. For instance, in 2021, a Dalit and a Brahmin woman got married, and the media decided to focus on the intercaste nature of the wedding. It depends on what is in the air at the time and what the media is interested in. So the media put it in the headline, intercaste marriage of two women. But this is not a new development at all. The first same-sex wedding that made national headlines, and I showed you the picture of Leela and Urmila in 1987, that was between a Dalit and a Kayastha, if you paid attention to the surnames, Leela Namdeo and Urmila Srivastava. But at that time, the media paid no attention at all to their caste because the idea of same-sex marriage itself was a new one. And so they focused entirely on gender, right? In 2004, likewise, Rajvinder Kaur, known as, this is the YouTube, those two women from Hamirpur, which I'll show later maybe. This is Leela and Urmila. Sorry, I don't know if I showed these are the two, 1987. But anyway, in 2004, Rajvinder Kaur, known as Raju, who was a Sikh, married a Dalit woman named Mala Kumar by Hindu rites in Amritsar. Both families were extremely upset. They filed missing person petitions. The women threatened to commit suicide. This is a typical pattern, and they fled to Delhi. And in 2004, 5 years before the anti-sodomy law was overturned, Judge Sanjeev Joshi said that the women enjoy the constitutional right to live according to their wishes, and no one has the right to interfere in their lives. But being permitted to live together didn't really help Raju and Mala. They returned to Amritsar. They got some sort of grudging acceptance from their families. Raju then eked out a living by selling vegetables, by driving an auto rickshaw and doing manual labor. But it was very difficult for them to live like this. And in 2007, Mala married a man. Raju then took sleeping pills and was hospitalized. And there were claims in the papers that Mala had poisoned her, but Mala denied this. And she said that she still loved Raju, but she wanted a home and children. She wanted a home and children. And local media reports seemed to kind of enjoy this. They repeatedly showed pictures of Mala happily riding behind her husband on his scooter. Raju's story continued in 2011 when she eloped with another Sikh woman, Poonam, to Chintpurni in Himachal Pradesh. They were arrested and brought back to Amritsar. In both cases, Raju stole money from her parents in order to elope. Even sadder is the story of two Sikh women, Baljeet Kaur and Rajvinder Kaur, both of them 20 and 21 years old. They eloped from their neighboring villages, Hasanpur Khurd and Hasanpur Kalan in Batala, Gurdaspur, Punjab. They ran away to a friend's house in Morinda, another city, and then they kept moving around. They went to Katra and Jammu and Kashmir, then they went to Vaishno Devi, which is a famous Hindu pilgrimage place in J&K. There they paid obeisance at the temple, and they got married by Hindu rites with the help of an army officer. Then they moved to the city of Chandigarh, and they were planning the final migration to Canada with the help of a friend in Toronto. But interestingly, the Sikh authority, the Akal Takht, issued an edict forbidding same-sex marriage. So they were asked about this by a journalist, and they said, we don't care about this. We went to the Golden Temple to pray to God for our marriage to be successful, and they added they want to adopt a child. So this indicates the difference between couples, how couples perceive religion. They perceive a difference between the religious authorities, who may say anything, and between divine blessing, which they think that they have. So journalists asked this couple to comment on the failure of the Raju Mala marriage, okay, because they're from the same district and the Sikhs were involved. They gave a very good response. They replied that cross-sex marriages also fail. both Baljit's and Rajvinder's family threatened to kill them, and they had to flee again. And this time they took refuge in a women's shelter in Patiala, a city in Punjab. Rajvinder's family tracked them there and took them to court, and they claimed that Baljit was 21 and Rajvinder was 20, but they said that she's older and she enticed our daughter with the promise of escape to Canada. Now, in court, as often happens, Rajvinder was pressured by her family into stating that she had been coerced into the relationship. And when she said that, Baljit, and this happened, I remember a case from the 80s that happened in Manushi, which was a Hindu woman and a Muslim woman and a Hindu man. And the same, I'm mixed up with, between a Muslim woman and a Hindu woman. And the same thing, in court, the Muslim woman backed out, just under pressure. So here, Baljit ran out of the courtroom and slit her wrists. And then the police gave her first aid and then arrested her for attempting suicide, which is a criminal offense. Anyway, so what do we conclude from these hundreds of stories of struggle? Many queer activists and theorists say that the demand for marriage equality is an upper class, upper caste, heteronormative demand. And one argument made is the poor don't have any property to divide, so why should they get married? And the life stories of these hundreds of couples, and the reason I gave you so many stories is just to impress upon you that the demand for marriage equality is cross-class, cross-caste, cross-gender, and it comes not from above, not from movement leaders. It comes from below, from ordinary people, many of whom, as I said, had no contact with any movement, no knowledge of any movement. Their demand precedes the demand for overturning the anti-sodomy law. And it's a demand that comes mostly from women and some transgender people. If I was looking at the numbers, mostly from women, second from transgender people, and a few men there are. This was, I should say, the case in the US too, where movement leaders and theorists were initially very much opposed to petitions for marriage equality. They thought it was the wrong time. They thought it was not a radical enough demand. The first petition for this was filed by two men as long ago as 1975. And even when the Windsor case went to court, many of the movement leaders were really quite dubious about it and even opposed to it. Let me come to the question of whether marriage is heteronormative. Now, many historians have pointed out that marriage is not a static institution. It's been continuously changing, and it would now be unrecognizable to biblical characters or even to people from the 18th or 19th centuries. I will give you the parallel example of the university. The university is a patriarchal institution that developed from the Christian monastery. You should know this at Cambridge. Peterhouse, the first college at Cambridge, was founded by the Bishop of Ely in 1284. Okay, many colleges were founded. Why? So that members would pray for the souls of their founders. What does the word professor mean? The word professor means one who professes the Christian religion. For this reason, Jews and later Catholics too were not allowed to graduate from Cambridge and Oxford right up to the 19th century. Now, because of this, Virginia Woolf proposed, as you probably know, that women should refuse to join universities. It turned out, of course, that I think that she was wrong. Maybe she was right, but it turned out that she was, I think, wrong. By joining universities, women and other groups transformed them. And the same process can be observed in marriage. We still use the word professor. We don't say we won't use it because it came from a Christian patriarchal background. In Love's Right, now this is a general argument, but I also make a special argument in Love's Right. And in Love's Right, I argue that male-female marriage is in fact modeled on the ideal of friendship. And friendship was primarily a same-sex institution everywhere in the world up to the 20th century. When a writer like Jane Austen refers to a woman's friends at the end of Emma, all their friends, the friends were happy, she includes family in the category of friends. Friends is the larger category, family is the smaller category. Now, of course, the situation is reversed in modern English. Biological family is separated from non-biological friends and treated as more important. So you say this friend is like family. So what would I say? In modern culture, the paradox is that biology trumps choice in modern culture, present-day culture. In medieval Sanskrit texts, a special friend is termed a swayamvara or self-chosen friend, which is different from run-of-the-mill friends. Okay, swayamvara sakha is a man's self-chosen male friend, and swayamvara sakhi is a self-chosen female friend. The word swayam means self, and the word vara means boon, wish, or desire, desired or wished for. So vara also comes to mean bridegroom, which means the desired one, but the real meaning of vara is choice, okay? So the use of swayamvara as an epithet for a special friend indicates the overlap between marriage and friendship. In the 11th century Katha Sarit Sagar, this term is used both for a man's male friend and a female's female friend, swayamvara sakha and sakhi. Such a friendship is referred to as janma antara, continuing from birth to birth. Like marriage, it is depicted as based on reciprocity, selfless devotion, and sacrifice. And as in ideal marriages, the partners live and die together. For instance, when a heavenly female Soma, I have to go faster now, when a heavenly female Soma Prabha sees Princess Kalingasena and is spontaneously attracted to her, she decides that they must have been linked in a former birth, and she should therefore choose Kalingasena as her Swayamvara Sakhi. Now, Kalingasena is surprised by the intensity of this relationship and of her feelings, and she tells herself, she justifies it to herself by citing a number of antecedents of female friends. This analysis is there in same-sex love in India. In other words, she looks to history for models, just as we do. And she cites actual names of a number of female friends. And they use a number of words for love to indicate their feelings, such as prema, sneha, preeti. It is only in the modern West that the cultural ideal of union shifts away from friendship entirely to heterosexual coupledom. For example, the US has had unmarried presidents in the past, but today I think it would be nearly impossible for a single man to be elected president. Heterosexual coupledom is seen as central to the good and happy life in which the president is supposed to model. In India, where the pre-modern still permeates the modern, there is no such requirement. Presidents and prime ministers' wives have not acquired the cachet that American first ladies have. India had a widow, Indira Gandhi, as prime minister, and as recently as 2003, a lifelong bachelor, Vajpayee, also. Even more interesting than their story is that of Jayalalitha, the longest-serving chief minister of Tamil Nadu, whose friendship with her live-in female companion, Sashikala, constituted part of her public persona. In the English language media, Sashikala was described as Jayalalitha's aide, close friend, and live-in confidant. The Tamil media termed her Jaya's Tori. Tori is, and my pronunciation may not be perfect, Tori is the equivalent of the Sanskrit Sakhi, a woman's female friend. In pre-modern narrative, royal and aristocratic heroines generally have a Tori. In July 2001, after her re-election as chief minister, Jayalalitha and Shashikala, they both went to the Sri Krishna temple at Guruvayur in Kerala to offer an elephant. And on another occasion, they visited the Shiva temple at Mylapore, Chennai. Now, in that temple, the custom is that after the tank is purified, a newlywed couple takes the first dip in the tank. On this occasion, these two women took the first dip and poured water on one another's heads in the presence of thousands. In March 92, they took a bath in the tank at the Kumbakonam temple, Tamil Nadu, on the occasion of the major festival held every 12 years. And Shashikala poured water from 21 silver vessels on Jaya's head, and she also did the same to her. And the national media reported all these events with photographs. This is also a cross-caste friendship. Jayalalitha was a Brahmin and Shashikala was a Thevar. After Jayalalitha's untimely and somewhat mysterious death, Shashikala, I don't know if you read, has recently re-entered politics, and she re-entered by making a vow at Jayalalitha's monument. Yeah? My point here is that the couples who choose the language of marriage do so because it is a language understood in the culture where friendship and lifelong union often overlap. There isn't a sharp boundary between friendship and marriage. Many pre-modern Indian narratives show friends spending their lives together. For instance, the example I gave you from the Katha Sirit Sagar, there's a merchant's son and there's a tribal chieftain, again cross-caste, and they choose one another as Swayamvara friends. They live together, one of them gets married, the other does not. And finally, when one of them commits suicide for his own reasons, he jumps off a cliff, his wife follows him, but his male friend also follows him and also jumps off the cliff. So Indian narratives stress likeness as the basis for friendship, love, and marriage. Some texts say that the norm of likeness is external attributes such as wealth and beauty, but many also stress a deeper likeness that transcends external disparities such as caste and harks back to a former birth. The beauty of pararomantic friends, Krishna and Arjuna, is frequently mentioned, like a couple of risen suns, like the bright and money-rayed moon and the sun risen after dispelling a gloom. So they stress likeness and beauty. And of course, between same-sex friends, the likeness is the gender. For example, the story of Ayappa. Ayappa had a Muslim friend who was inseparable from him, who was a Muslim. And there's a shrine for him in Ayappa's temple. And the story is that Ayappa asked his father to build a shrine for Vavar, saying, consider Vavar as myself. Your friend is your other self. And Ayappa's shrine today is also the focus of pilgrimage when people go to they also go to the shrine for Vavar, for his friend. This stress on likeness is an important example of the way that ideals of same-sex love have influenced later ideals of heterosexual marriage. For example, today a wife is called her husband's better half, but that phrase is not applied to friends, right? Before the 20th century, it was commonplace to think of your friend as your other half or a second self. Think of Tennyson's poem for his best friend in the 19th century, right? Cicero writes, when a man thinks of a true friend, he is looking at himself in the mirror. Yeah. And apart from friendships, of course, Indian texts also acknowledge the idea of same-sex marriage. I've written about this at length, so I won't go into it, but basically the birth of a child to two women who have divinely blessed sexual intercourse, right? And the description of their love as very romantic in the rainy season, etc. I'll give you a couple of examples of long-term relationships in medieval India, particularly the first one. Two 18th century poets. They were inseparable friends or whatever you want to call them. But when the Maulvi died, Mukarram observed Iddat. It's a period of mourning observed by widows. And he inherited all the Maulvi's property. Okay. And then I've also written about Urdu Rekhti poetry, written mostly by Muslim men, and prose. In the prose too, there are many terms for a woman's female intimate partner and for sexual love between women. But most interesting is this description by Saadat Yar Khan Rangeen, who says two women each take a cardamom and break it open, and then they go through this ritual. Then they get married among their female companions, and these are called each other's ilaichi. And in my novel, I have described this ritual being performed between and witnessed by their female friends, as Rangeen describes it, following Rangeen. So there's also references to their sexual intimacy. I like this really suggestive line, how delightfully we spent last night. My hands devoted themselves to you last night. I felt so devoted to my hands all night. This is by a poet called Nisbat, and the manuscript was almost lost. All of this poetry in the colonial era was seen as obscene. It was labeled obscene and immoral, and it virtually disappeared. I had to copy it out by pencil from manuscripts, right? And this manuscript was almost lost. This poet, Nisbat's manuscript was almost lost. There were just a few lines by him. It was rediscovered in a secondhand bookshop in Pakistan, and then the person who rediscovered and bought it kindly shared it with me so that I could use some of those poems in the book. Right. There were also poems about men in love with men, about kisses between men, women, all of this, right? And here's the Urdu, and there was a word called Chapti Nama, which is a kind of poem that tells a story about what we call lesbian love, right? So finally, I have argued that rebirth is one of the ideas that energizes socially disapproved relationships, intercaste, cross-class relationships. And in the present era, many Hindu teachers, priests, and ordinary people have cited this idea repeatedly to legitimize same-sex and transgender marriage. Particularly transgender people invoke this idea to claim that they belong to a different gender in an earlier lifetime, which is why their current body does not match the gender of the self. Now, this is an idea easily understood in India. Rebirth is accepted by Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Sikhism, but many Indians not belonging to those religions also refer to rebirth in everyday conversation, either seriously or playfully, to explain otherwise inexplicable attachments. On the other hand, the spirit in Hindu thought is ultimately not gendered. In most religions, the spirit has no gender, right? So I'm going to now just quickly show a couple of things. I interviewed Swami Bodhananda, who conducted the 93 marriage, and he said that I thought that all relationships are the same. They want to live together, so I have to. I interviewed the Shaiva priest who conducted this wedding in 2002, and he said that he thought about it. He had never faced such a thing. He thought about it, and he said, well, marriage is a union of spirits. The spirit is not male or female. So that is why he performed, and they went on to overturn to challenge the Defense of Marriage Act. On the other hand, Hindu teachers and organizations are very divided on the question, of course. This is what Baba Ramdev said, that homosexuality is not genetic. If our parents were homosexuals, we wouldn't have been born. So it's unnatural. But then in 2018, when the government did not defend the anti-sodomy law and the court overturned it, then he changed his mind and said homosexuals are not criminals. Sri Ravi Shankar has consistently argued for decriminalization, and he argues with some knowledge. He also quotes the scriptures for this. Okay, I want to end with an astonishing development that took place in 2006. Okay, there were these two tribal women, Thingring Basumatari and Roynati Basumatari. They faced intense persecution from people of their village. I don't have a picture of them, but this is the temple where they got married, okay? Thingring is a daily wage laborer. Roynati is a domestic help. Both are Bodo tribals. They grew up in North Pakriguri in Assam, fell in love as young girls, and got married at the Mahamaya temple in 1999. It's one of the great goddess temples, the Shakti Pitha. Now, they faced intense persecution from people of their village. They were publicly whipped both before and after their marriage. Finally, they fled the village, and for 3 years, they moved from one village to another, finding it hard to get work. Finally, they reached the Bodo village of Garubasha, and there they were accepted for some reason. They settled down and have been living there ever since. So an astonishing development took place in 2006 during the state legislative assembly elections. When candidates came to ask for votes, the villagers asked them to bring in a law to recognize Thingring and Roynati's marriage. 2006, this is while the anti-sodomy law was still in place. 15 years. And the candidates were taken aback and they said, okay, we'll try to do something about it. But the couple knew that bold promises are rarely kept. And Tingring said told a journalist, they all listen to us and even promise help. Hope is the only thing that we poor people have. And I'll conclude on that note. The court may or may not endorse marriage equality in this round. In any case, it's too late for many of us. But hope is the only thing that all of us have.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Vanita. I think your presentation and the book Love's Right call for renewed attention to the intersections of queerness, race, class, religion, and caste. And today, through the stories of Urmila, Leela, Raju, Mala, Rajwinder, Tingring, and many other struggles and stories, you've trained the spotlight on the ways in which these hierarchies have framed relationships with epistemic and institutional power. And again, reminding us that same-sex unions are not and never were an exclusively modern phenomenon.